All right, it's 10:01, so we can go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining, and thanks Amy for being willing to do this session. I know with the weather at at the Nebraska Planning Conference, I had to cancel this one, so happy we're still able to follow up with this. It is being recorded right now, so we will post this and share it out. So if anyone knows someone else who might be interested, they will still be able to watch it. So Amy, I will turn it over to you and let you introduce yourself.
All right. Thank you so much, Kale. Yeah, I apologize that we didn't make it to the conference this year. It was a bummer. We had snow right before that, so that's the way it goes in Nebraska. We get random weather. So I'm going to go ahead and get my slide set shared and let me know if it's not displaying correctly. Um, so my name is Amy Schmidt. I am a professor in down on campus at UNL, and I have appointments in biological systems engineering and animal science. So I'm kind of split between those two departments. Um, the partners that I worked with putting this slide set together for the conference included Steve Martin, our executive director of AFAN, Brad Edel, who is now the supervisor of livestock permitting, compliance, and inspection at what is now the Department of Water, Energy, and Environment. And I don't know if they have an official new logo, so what you see there is not an official logo. That's just my, I felt like I needed to put something there, and it wasn't the NDEE old
And
logo. So,
Amy,
um,
we're actually not able to see if you're sharing slides. I'm not seeing them right now.
yeah, really. Okay, let me try again, like turning it off and back on.
There we go.
Now are you
Okay,
seeing?
there
Okay,
we go.
okay. Um, yeah, so don't anybody go like sharing that as their official new logo. It's not. And then Valerie Parsons, livestock development specialist at the Nebraska Department of Ag. And I believe I saw Valerie on here as a participant. So if you want to elevate her to a host or speaker so that she can respond to questions too, that would be great. Let's see here. Okay. So just a little bit about me. I've been here at UNL for just about 13 years, but I spent 13 years prior to that in extension at Iowa State, University of Missouri, and Mississippi State University. So I have an appointment that's split between extension and research. So meaning that I do research that I deliver through extension, and I develop research based on things that I learned when I'm out working with farmers and community members. So it's an integrated program there. We also have an animal manure management team at the university. We've kind of elevated our presence in the last several years, but some folks still don't maybe know about us. Our website is manure.unl.edu. And there's three of us that are specialists on campus, and then we have educators out in the state that are part of it. And we work together to deliver research-based information, do trainings for livestock producers, crop producers. We've had some county officials come to our trainings as well. And I'll talk about some of those outreach opportunities here in just a bit. But just to make you aware, there's a whole group of us that work in this area, trying to ensure that we're doing things the right way, the best way possible when it comes to livestock manure management. So my goal today, my goal period with working in this area with county officials and potential livestock producers and the neighbors around them is to support data-driven decision making. So we have shared natural resource goals. We have emotion that gets involved a lot in decisions about animal feeding operations, and I understand all that, and I can empathize with the folks that bring up those issues. My goal, though, is not to necessarily help you make a decision, but to give you data-driven content that helps you make that decision. So when I say shared natural resource goals, I think this is universal no matter who you are in this state, or it should be universal. Our goals are we want to minimize erosion and runoff and leaching of nutrients and contaminants that can contribute to surface and groundwater quality impairment. We want to conserve and manage species and habitats. We see a lot of changes in land use and development and weather patterns, and our goal is to develop resilient systems and ensure that we're not taking land that should be in a conservation practice and putting it in a land use that maybe contributes to greater soil erosion and nutrient loss. And then reducing greenhouse gas emissions related to climate change. And I know climate change is a maybe controversial term. I kind of prefer to talk about changing weather patterns because I know from growing up in Southeast Iowa to now, the weather patterns have changed a lot in those years. And so we need to consider those when we're working in the agricultural sector to ensure that we have resilient systems to those new weather extremes that we're seeing. So the basis of most of the information I'm going to share with you today is this idea that soil health is very important to protecting natural resources. And so production practices that support soil health benefit our natural resources and then those of us who rely on them. So it goes back to the nutrient cycling in the environment, habitats for species, water quality and quantity. It's all kind of tied together. And so as I go through some of these common questions that we hear, I'll refer back to some of these principles of soil health and resilient landscapes. So I've pulled, I don't know, I have maybe half a dozen questions here that I've gotten in the last few years. It's by no means all encompassing. And I hope, want to leave time at the end, or you're welcome to interrupt in the middle to ask a question that you don't see addressed. I don't want to avoid any questions, but I tried to kind of identify the most common ones that I hear. And I will say these come from concerned citizens as well as county officials, and so I answer questions the same way with them as I would with a crop farmer or a livestock farmer. So first of all, manure is a pollutant and it's going to ruin our water quality, or the proposed operation is only a mile from a waterway, so manure is going to flow into that water. And I think the place to start with talking about this question is understanding how manure nutrients, especially nitrogen and phosphorus, move in the environment. So we have a number of ways that water moves across soil and through soil. We have runoff, which is directly running off into surface water. We have leaching, so that water is leaching through the soil profile, reaching groundwater and often traveling horizontally to reach surface waters as well. And then we have erosion. So nitrogen, we can lose that through leaching through the soil to the groundwater, and we can also lose it by runoff. So dissolved nitrogen that is carried in runoff from a field can get into surface water. Phosphorus is primarily lost through runoff and erosion. It is possible to have phosphorus leaching. We generally don't see that being as big of an issue here. It's a small contribution compared to what can leave the soil surface through runoff and erosion. So phosphorus tends to bind into soil and organic matter particles. So when you're losing soil off of your field to erosion, you're probably carrying phosphorus with it. So that's regardless of where that nitrogen and phosphorus come from, they move the same in the environment. What's different about an organic fertilizer like manure versus a synthetic or inorganic, a manufactured fertilizer? The plants themselves, if there's nitrogen and phosphorus available, they don't care where it came from. So, you know, if it's there, they're going to use it. The problem is with synthetic fertilizers, those are manufactured to be available right away. So if I put nitrogen down in my garden, and I'm going to wait a week to plant my garden, and I get a big rainfall in that week, probably not going to be a lot of that nitrogen left for my plants because it was available when it was put on, and it's soluble in water, could leach through the soil profile. With an organic fertilizer like manure, we do have some readily available nitrogen in the form of ammonium, but we also have a significant portion of that manure that's organic nitrogen. So it's nitrogen that's tied up in the organic matter that's in that soil. So the solids in that are in that manure. And that has to be broken down by microbes in the soil to make it available. So when we talk about manure being a slow release fertilizer, the idea is you could put it on before planting and have some nitrogen and phosphorus readily available when those plants start to grow, but it's also going to become nitrogen become available over the cropping season as that organic matter is broken down by organisms in the soil and converted into a form of nitrogen that plants can use. So I definitely don't have any opposition to inorganic fertilizer or a preference for manure. I think they work very well together, but I think it's important to understand how they work and how they differ in the environment. So I want to talk quite a bit about this direct relationship between soil quality and water quality. Soil health is a very common term that we hear now, regenerative agriculture, resilient landscapes. All of these go back to this idea of improving our soil quality. So we farmed land for years and years and years. When you harvest a crop, you're taking nutrients that crop took up from the soil. They're leaving that site as the harvested grain and forage. And if you're not putting organic matter back into that system, then you're really you're using that system. You're mining those nutrients and that organic matter, and you're not really replenishing it. So over time, that soil tends to become less fertile, lower quality soil. And so we hear a lot about building soil organic matter and adding organic nutrients and carbon back into the soil system. The reason that improves soils is that microorganisms in the soil need carbon material and organic matter as a food source. So if you're feeding the soil, you have a whole ecosystem going on below your feet in a soil. So most people that have a garden, you put compost or manure, bagged organic matter, different products that are rich in organic matter to improve that soil. If you grow crops in there year after year and never really replenish that, you're eventually going to not be happy with the tomatoes and peppers and how those things grow in your garden. You see the same thing, I think, in houseplants. When you buy that potting soil, it's so rich and it's got a balance of nutrients. It's in good shape. Your plants grow. 2 or 3 years later, you realize my plants aren't doing so well, and it's probably because we've used up everything that was in that soil. If we're not adding back to it, the plants are lacking something that they need. So when we improve soil properties, things like aggregate stability, ability to retain moisture, to infiltrate rainfall as opposed to having it run off because the surface is crusted or otherwise it's not taking in that moisture. We want to improve those soil properties to improve those physical characteristics. Water infiltration, water holding capacity, resistance to erosion, resistance to runoff. We also have best management practices. And so it really doesn't matter to me if you are using inorganic fertilizer or manure on a field. Part of that process of keeping things on that field where plants can use them is using best management practices. So we have a difference in how manure nitrogen and inorganic nitrogen move in the environment. We also have the quality of the soil that impacts how nutrients may move and leave that soil surface. So there's a really close connection between the quality of our soil and the quality of our water. If we have good soil and we're using best management practices, there should be very little risk of losing nutrients through runoff and erosion. And I'm not going to show a bunch of data today, but I have that. I'd be happy to share where we've looked at inorganic versus organic fertilizer and how does that affect root zone nitrogen? Do we have more nitrate leaching with a soil that's high in organic matter versus lower in organic matter? And the data always shows we really do positively impact water quality if we have good, healthy soil and we're using best management practices for nutrient applications. When we think about best management practices, you've probably all seen a construction site where there's either this, like a silt fence or these other barriers to keep sediment from leaving the site. So while you're waiting for grass to establish, or you've got a lot of bare soil, you don't want that material washing away with rainwater. The same thing is true in agriculture. We have a lot of best management practices, probably more that are becoming more technical, but at the very base, one of our key best management practices with nutrients is you want to use the right source of nutrient at the right rate, at the right time, and put it in the right place. So we want to make sure we're putting on the nutrients the crop needs and we're not over applying nutrients, right? So the right rate is put on enough. You can always come back later and put on more, and you can monitor through the season. If you are deficient in nitrogen, you can come back and spoon feed that nitrogen to the system versus putting it all on at the beginning of the season or, fertigating the field continuously all summer, maybe putting on extra because, why not just let that system run once you've turned it on in the summer? Right time means, we don't want to put nitrogen on where a crop isn't going to use it. One of the things we've really started to adopt in the state is cover crops. So you have a crop growing in the fallow season when your corn and soybeans aren't growing. So you have a crop there using the nitrogen in the soil rather than letting it leach into groundwater. And then the right place. I'll talk a little bit about setbacks and regulations about how manure is applied, but it comes down to putting it where it needs to be, when it can be used, at a rate that is needed, and using the right sources of those nutrients. So I mentioned this idea of soil aggregate stability. When we improve aggregate stability, we reduce runoff and erosion. So aggregate stability is small particles of soil that start to stick together and form larger particles. The larger those particles become, the more stable they are, the less likely to be moved by wind or water and carried by erosion. And that happens through biological activity in the soil. If you don't have good biology of your soil and you continue to farm that land, over time, you're just increasing that risk of erosion because you're breaking soil particles and not giving them a chance to rebuild. We also know organic nitrogen is less prone to leaching than inorganic nitrogen. So aside from the nutrients that you get from those two sources of nitrogen, manure is the only one that is going to contribute to increasing soil organic matter. And soil organic matter helps, like I said, feed the microbes in the soil. Those microbes go to work and increase the quality of the soil, and then we can hold more water in it. We have greater aggregate stability. We have less risk for runoff and erosion. So that all comes back to this idea of it's really not about how close is a farm to a water body. It's more how are they managing that manure and that land to ensure that what they're putting on the soil is what the crop needs, and not we're not putting on more than it needs, or applying too close to a water body and those sorts of things. When we think about practices to minimize nitrogen and phosphorus losses to water, like I said, apply to meet the crop needs. Any permitted animal feeding operation has to conduct soil sampling and analysis. They have to follow a nutrient management plan. They have to report their nutrient inventories and how they've used nutrients annually. That's not a requirement for anyone else, really. If you're not a permitted animal feeding operation, you don't have that requirement to submit a nutrient management plan and report that you've used nutrients the way that you plan to. We encourage utilizing setbacks from surface waters and wells. So as you're applying manure or fertilizer, don't do that right up to the edge of a stream. Again, if you're a permitted animal feeding operation, those setbacks are written into your regulation. Those are enforced, and we don't have those same setback requirements for inorganic fertilizer. So that's another difference, where if you're permitted and you're applying manure, you have to follow these setbacks. Others should follow them, but that's not always the case. We want to see infield and edge of field practices that reduce erosion, improve soil health, and improve cropland resilience. And again, a big part of that is adding organic matter back to that system. Residue management, cover crops, minimal tillage. There's a lot of practices that we recommend. So it's not just manure alone, but manure is a part of that system that helps improve overall quality of the soil. Anything that provides organic amendments to the soil is a good thing. So I mentioned setbacks. This is one of our kind of info cards that we've developed for our manure management team, and we give this. In fact, a lot of our custom applicators keep this in the cabs of their vehicles as a reminder. This is a large CAFO. This is a small or medium. What are the setback requirements? At the risk of offending any of our, regulators, the setbacks, in my opinion, are really not scientific. And the reason I say that is if you look at a small or medium animal feeding operation, they have to stay at least 30 feet from any surface water, wells, or open tiles if they're stockpiling manure or applying it. Large animal feeding operations have to stay at least 100 feet from sensitive water bodies. Or they can, instead of 100 feet, they can reduce that setback if they plant like a vegetative buffer around that sensitive area. There's really no scientific reason why owning 50 cows, say, that their manure is less likely to travel into water, and so you only have to stay 30 feet back when you apply it, versus 5,000 head feedlot. That manure is not more likely to travel in the environments, but we still require larger setbacks. So those setbacks are all states have them like that, different based on the size of the operation, but we don't have those setbacks for inorganic fertilizer applications. So one of the things I want to show in this slide, if we have a water body here, if we think of that orange line, that's kind of the 30 feet setback, and it's definitely not to scale, but so 30 feet setback if you're a small AFO or CAFO applying manure. The blue line is 100 feet back if you're a large CAFO. And then I mentioned you could put in a vegetative buffer 35 feet wide and be able to apply right up to that buffer. That's another option. With inorganic fertilizer, we don't have a regulation on setbacks or vegetative buffers or any of those conservation practices. So, to me, we're using manure in a more environmentally sustainable way when we're using a nutrient management plan and we're following these best management practices to reduce losses of nutrients to water bodies. So talking of regulations, another question is, yeah, we know there's regulations for livestock, but how do we know they're being enforced? That's I think it's a valid question. I'm not on the enforcement side, but I do know that our regulatory agency in the state does inspections of permitted operations. There's reporting requirements, like I mentioned, of having a nutrient management plan and then reporting your actual use of nutrients and movement of nutrients to ensure that you are following that plan. They definitely, they investigate complaints. It may not be that day that the complaint is filed, but they're obligated to investigate those complaints, and they're obligated to enforce any regulatory issues that they find on an operation. And that's not just for permitted animal feeding operations. That's for anywhere that manure from livestock is being land applied. So even if it's being transferred to a farmer to use later on their field, they still are subject to following the rules that I talked about with setbacks and that, but there's not an annual inspection process there. That's they're going to respond if there's a concern raised about a site like that. Another common question. My family's going to get sick from ammonia, dust, odors, other gases from the proposed operation. I'm not a medical specialist. What I do know about odor, for instance, is that we all have different sensory responses to different odors. I personally like the smell of gasoline. A lot of people, that gives them a headache. I hate the smell of cigarette smoke. That gives me a headache. Other people, it doesn't really bother. So we all have some different responses to odors. We can never, ever build an operation and guarantee that no one beyond a mile or 5 miles will never smell that operation. That's just not possible. What we can do is use the science of atmospheric conditions, of topography of land, of distance, things like that, to look at the probability of an odor being detectable at a certain distance, a certain percentage of time. And so our odor footprint tool is probably our best method for kind of trying to predict. If you live a mile to the north of this facility, there's 98% of the time you should not be able to detect an offensive odor. But again, offensiveness of an odor is very subjective to an individual. So what bothers one person may not affect another person at all. So there's a lot of there's a lot of sensory and emotional responses tied to odors, to sounds, all of these sensory things going on around us we all react to those a little bit differently. So again, no real way to say you're never going to smell this, but we use science the best we can to make that that prediction. And then we encourage best practices for siting and managing operations. Again, even if you are separated by the distance that the county requires, you know, there are other ways you can improve the, I guess, relationship with neighbors, or reduce the likelihood of neighbors being able to smell or see manure management activities on your farm. So going back to the idea that, you know, we're going to get sick from the gases, the dust, the odors. One thing I will say is odors themselves don't cause illness, but they do cause maybe psychological response. The components that make up those odors are, you know, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia are the two that we talk about most, but there's other gases in there. If we look at data from like OSHA that talks about exposure limits for hydrogen sulfide or ammonia, we have to realize those exposure limits that cause a negative reaction in a person are usually for like a very high concentration for maybe a short or long period of time. And those concentrations are very unlikely to be high enough as you move away from that operation to impact someone. So for instance, hydrogen sulfide, I would definitely tell a farmer, don't ever enter a manure storage area without proper respiratory equipment, because we know hydrogen sulfide can be very high in those areas where it's contained and could, you know, cause immediate death. But to the person standing outside the building, not likely to bother them at all. So then as you move farther downwind, you still detect that odor of that gas, but it's far less likely to really impact health substantially. Dust is another one I hear about. I feel like dust that originates from like cropping system, tillage, and gravel roads is far more prevalent than what you would get from a livestock operation. One of the reasons for that, to look at say a swine farm from 40 years ago versus today, is night and day difference. When you look at these modern facilities, the way they're built, you don't, you know, I've been in some older facilities where I always come out coughing because there's dust in the air, spend a few hours in there, and it really bothers me. But the modern facilities tend to be designed to control those dusts, and you know, you don't have near as much dust being formed in there. They're just a cleaner facility. And so we follow best management practices for minimizing dust dispersion. I personally probably get more annoyed by the gravel road dust at my house than anything that would be coming from livestock around there. Flies, again, people say, well, we're gonna have flies everywhere if this operation goes in a mile away. Again, those farmers need to have, you know, practices in place for sanitation, drainage, managing feedstocks, so there's not a source of food for those flies to be attracted to. The other thing is flies aren't likely to travel very far from their food source or their mating or resting site. So while you could go on a farm and have you know, noticeable amount of flies around you, if you walk off of that property to the road, you probably aren't going to have, you know, you're not going to experience a lot of flies. They just don't tend to go too far from where their food and their mating sites and their and resting sites are. Disposal of mortalities is another issue. It happens no matter how well an operation is managed, there's mortalities that occur. And there's a requirement to dispose of those mortalities within 36 hours of identifying this animal that needs disposed of. So, you know, if I've had calls where people say this person has had animals laying out here for 2 days, that's a problem. They should not be doing that, and that's something you could report to the regulatory agency, and they would respond to. So, you know, there's rules in place, and if they're not being followed, then you're well within your rights to notify somebody and make sure that they're getting corrected. And so I wouldn't hesitate to do that. This, as an engineer, one of my favorites, or maybe not so favorites, is how do you know manure storages won't leak? And so I'm typically thinking of a lot of times it's a concrete slurry pit under a swine building, and they say, yeah, I mean, I know that's better than an outdoor lagoon type storage, but how do you know it won't leak? And my response to them is, well, everything we build is based on some design standard. As engineers, we have, like, let me show this one on here. We have resources, design standards that say, how thick concrete needs to be, how much reinforcement, what sort of water gap protection needs to be between the walls and the floors. How large do you, what's the spacing you should use between columns, all of these design standards. And we see those same design standards used in building homes, in building roads, schools, our septic systems. I don't have any way of guaranteeing, I guess, that my septic system at my house is not leaking, but I purchased from a reputable supplier. It was installed by a professional, and it has a predictive lifespan based on how it was designed and built. So I guess I have to have faith in those standards and how they were developed, and have faith that they were developed correctly. And so, can I guarantee that a storage will never leak? No, I can't. I also can't guarantee that that a structure that was built correctly won't have some higher wind event or snow load or something that it was designed for that causes a failure. But those things are designed with safety in mind. And I personally, I hope that people respect the fact that design standards are based on science and engineering, and not just, they don't pull those out of thin air. So, yeah, I'd love to make guarantees, but I know better than to make any guarantees in design or operation of systems. How can we be sure a nutrient management plan is written correctly and that a farmer will follow it? A nutrient management plan is required as part of a CAFO permit. It has to be reviewed, and it is reviewed by, I still show NDE here, but it's now the Department of Water, Environment, and Energy. And they enforce it through annual reporting. I don't think I've ever talked to those folks at NDE and not had them say that they're in the middle of reviewing nutrient management plans or annual reports. That's what they do. They're looking at that nutrient management plan to say, did this farmer consider, and did they plan for, and did they actually do things the way they said they planned for, to put on the right source of nutrients at the right time, at the right rate, in the right place? And do they have records showing that they've tested their soil, they've tested their manure, they've predicted their yield, they've adjusted based on the actual yield? There's a lot behind the scenes that goes into those nutrient management plans. And I guess, if you suspect that a farmer's not following a nutrient management plan, then again, that's something that is, they're legally bound to follow if they're permitted animal feeding operations. So there's, there's the ability to question that, or to ask for regulatory review of it. So this is one about a year ago that I spent quite a bit of time talking with the county official about. And it was a site where there were partners involved. So, there's a belief that maybe we shouldn't have contract operations, integrators and grower relationships. Maybe you should not be allowed to have that relationship where you're growing for someone else because that's competing with just the individual family farm. Or we should only allow livestock farms to have a single owner that owns the animals, the building, and the land. So my response to that is, first of all, if you've looked at land prices in Nebraska recently, they are out of this world. I've been looking for land in rural Cass County for years, and I'm probably not going to buy any because I can't afford 10 acres, let alone 1,000 acres to start a cropping system. So partnerships for a lot of farmers may be the only financial option to get into farming, especially when you think about the investment in constructing a building, purchasing that land, the equipment to farm that land. Do you invest in the manure application equipment yourself, or do you hire that out to custom hauler? There are just a lot of expenses, and partnerships help distribute that risk. And the same is true when we have that integrator and grower relationship of knowing that my integrator has negotiated marketing of these animals. They have more power to get the best deal on the price for these animals because they're marketing so many than I do as a small independent producer. So there's risk that gets distributed there when I don't have to worry about negotiating when, where, and how much I'm going to get for my animals each time they're sent to market. There was a couple that I talked to a few years back when they had an open house for their new Lincoln premium poultry grower site. And I thought their discussion was pretty compelling, that they both grown up in rural areas. They always wanted to come back to Nebraska and own farmland once they finished college, but they couldn't afford to. They were working in a metropolitan area where they could both get jobs, and to leave those, well-paying jobs and move back to Nebraska and buy cropland, they just couldn't afford to do that. But when Lincoln Premium Poultry came along, it gave them a chance to purchase a smaller plot of land where they could raise chickens, and they didn't have to take on all that risk by themselves. And they were super excited to be back home, closer to family, where grandparents got to see the grandkids more often. So this partnership I think is what is allowing some of these smaller or these newer, younger generations to return back to the farm. It's for some, that's the only way they can afford to do it. So here, a proposed farm doesn't need a state permit, so no one's going to regulate how they manage manure. While we have specific regulations and permitting requirements for large CAFOs, every animal feeding operation is required to manage manure to prevent discharges to waters of the state. So it doesn't matter if you are 10,000 cattle or a couple of show pigs in your backyard. You are still, if you're confining those animals, you are still required to prevent discharges of manure to waters of the state. We have this flyer that we put together several years ago that's Mind Your Manure Manners. To me, that's for everybody that doesn't necessarily have a permit, but they may receive manure from an animal feeding operation, or they may have a small animal feeding operation that doesn't require a permit. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be, like we say, minding their manners in how and when they apply that manure to their land. And if you see a farmer mismanaging manure, you are, within your rights to contact the state, and they'll investigate the complaint. And this is their link. It still works, although it's still the NDE link. I checked it yesterday. It still works despite the name change and the consolidation of some of those regulatory agencies in the state. Another question I get: I think the applicant underestimated how much manure and nutrients their animals will produce each year. How do I know that their calculations are correct? again, this tends to happen if a permit gets submitted, or an application gets submitted to the county before it's gone through a state review, or it's submitted to the county because it's below the regulation, the limit for needing a state permit. And so when I talk through that question with folks, I have to get an idea of where did the data come from that they're using. We have book values. I have a lot, standards from the American Society of Ag and Biological Engineers, from Midwest Plan Service, from other organizations that work in this area. NRCS has some book values on manure production and nutrients. Those book values are great for estimating, but there's really nothing that trumps actual operational data. And so a lot of times you have a system coming in that, if it is part of an integrator-grower relationship, that exact same size and design of building with the exact same genetics of animals and the exact same feeding and watering equipment is already operating somewhere in that area. And so they already have data from operation of that site for several years to know that, we tend to have a lot less manure generated because we don't waste water as much as maybe they did 10 or 20 years ago. So those operational data, I feel like that is much more accurate data than book values. And we use book values when we really don't have anything better to use. But book values, it's kind of like looking at what your blood pressure should be for your age and gender. And there's book values, but then your genetics will cause that to be different for you than they would for maybe the general population. So your actual data is probably more valuable to you than published averages. So this is a big one, and I get it. The proposed farm will decrease my property value. You can look at studies that are out there. AFAN did an evaluation of home sales near swine and poultry farms several years back. University of Missouri's done kind of a study, a meta-analysis, which is, let's look at all these studies where they've evaluated property values near operations and then take all that data and try to make sense of it in one analysis. The distance from the farm is going to impact that. The availability of housing is going to impact your property values regardless of where you're located. How close are you to amenities like grocery stores and activities for your kids, whatever. So there's a lot of things that go into that. Our group is trying to gather data this summer to try to come up with a more Nebraska specific set of data that we can use to talk about this topic, but there's so many things that impact it, that there's really no way to say 100% yes or no, this won't impact your property value. Definitely an area where more research is needed. So the last thing I want to go through is some of the resources that we have. Hopefully everybody's heard of the Ag Site Planner. We released this in 2018. Initially, we set out to have a risk management tool and a regulatory guidance tool, and then kind of a list of what are the critical topics that we need to think about and talk about, whether we're a farmer wanting to build a new operation, whether we're a neighbor who has heard this operation's coming in. What are the things we need to talk about to make sure we're all understanding and on the same page. We've continued to add to that critical questions over time, but I want to specifically talk about the risk management tool and the regulatory guidance tool, of what we've recently added to those and how they work. The odor footprint tool, which is a great tool, but not super easy to navigate in its Excel spreadsheet based form, and not super easy to make sense of if you don't have a working knowledge of it. So we've integrated that odor footprint tool into the website as an online tool that explains the data as it comes out. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. And then we have the livestock siting assessment matrix up there, and other resources related to livestock production. But the risk management tool, what's unique about that, it's available to anybody. You can use it on your own property where you know, if you have a home, a small acreage, whatever, you can look at that. You can look at any piece of land in the state or county that you want to look at. It's open source. What you do when you go into that is you're going to zoom in to select a region. So we have basically the state of Nebraska here, and we continue to zoom in until we can find that property that we're particularly interested in. And once we're zoomed in, there's a tool that allows you to draw a border around that property. So the report you generate is specific to the land in that region that you've identified. And when you've got the region identified, you can click on use region, and it will generate a report that summarizes. This is one of the newer parts of it, is we're trying to include more of the county level zoning regulations in there. That's a question that we get from people, and you guys know as well as I do, they differ for every county. There's small differences, there's large differences, and we just are trying to summarize it to the extent we can so that individuals who are looking for a place to raise livestock in Nebraska can understand what the requirements are in different counties. We list a county zoning contact. I realize those change. So if your particular county is not correct on there, let us know. We've got a link. We want to hear from you if any of that information is not correct. And then whenever we share this report information, we want to explain why it's important. So you'll see these yellow why is it important boxes on the report. We try to summarize the zones and the zoning regulations in each individual county. The report will also show you where nearby populations are located, public schools, state parks, anything that might cause an issue, being too close to a park or a school or things like that that could be that may not appreciate having a livestock operation there. Again, with these, why is it important? And then the resources. The odor footprint tool is a big one if we're talking about proximity to neighbors. We have hydrology information. Some of this data is still being uploaded into there, but nearby wells, water bodies, streams, are there hydrologic issues? We don't see that as much here as, say, kind of Missouri, Arkansas, where we have a lot of karst topography, where we would not want to have a manure storage in an area where the structure is not suitable for that. But it, depth to groundwater, where are the wells, those sorts of things. Why is it important? Well, we dictate that a waste control facility can't be constructed within 100 feet of a well used for domestic purposes. So it explains why that matters, and then explains the rules related to it. And then the windrows information. This is similar to an image you would get from the odor footprint tool, but it explains what does this mean? What does this diagram mean? And helps understand the direction and intensity of winds during different times of the year in a particular location. So I would encourage you to take a look at that and play around with it if you haven't. The regulatory guidance tool is a bit more, few more steps to that, but it's intended for you as county officials, or for a producer or anybody, to pick a county and the type of livestock I want to raise and how many and how do I want to confine them, and then figure out, am I an AFO, a small AFO, a medium AFO, am I a CAFO? Depending on which of those comes back, what are the regulatory requirements that I need to consider? And then it gives the contact information again for in the county level specific zoning information as well. So I want to make sure we have some time for questions, so I'm going to wrap up there. I have some slides beyond this one if we want to look at any, recent data, but I think for now, let's end here and welcome your feedback and questions. And if there's questions I didn't cover that you get often, I'm happy to do another one of these down the road. So let me know if there's topics we didn't get to that you would like to hear more about. So thank you all.
Thanks, Amy. Does anyone have any questions? You're welcome to unmute yourself or put them in the chat.
I know I couldn't have covered everything that effectively that there's no question. So.
Jane, I see you raised your hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Amy, I'd like you to talk a little bit more about when an integrator and a farmer engage in a contract, how that partnership distributes the risk. It's been my experience that the farmer assumes a lot more risk than the integrator. They have to invest in land if they don't have it already. They have to build the housing for the animals. They take on so much more risk. The integrator or the corporate ag organization minimizes their risk, and they control that contract. So could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on the contracts, and I know they differ between different integrators in the state, different species of livestock that are being raised. But what I hear from, a person who is entering into that contract as a grower is one, I cannot, as an independent grower of pigs or chickens, I don't have the ability or the I don't know what the word is. I'm not a big enough operation to negotiate a good market rate for my animals. And I am at the mercy of fluctuations in the market more than a larger entity that can supply their supply of and quality of product doesn't deviate as much as maybe a small farmer's would. And so there's some risk that's shared there in just the ability to have a place in that market. And then there's also some, as far as my understanding, if those animals, if you have a disease comes through that knocks out those animals, a smaller producer may not be able to recover from that. Their downtime is going to be significant, and then they've got to try to find the supply to restock that building. Whereas in an integrator situation, that's it's less likely to slow down that operation as much or impact them as negatively. And then the grower also is getting that manure, which has a lot of value. The farmers I know that have that talk about growing pigs, for instance, and they put up their buildings to have manure for their fields, and now they're saving a significant amount on fertilizer inputs because they are not purchasing inorganic fertilizer, and they're getting profit from the animals, but now they're also getting that manure that offsets their fertilizer costs. So I would say there is no contract out there that is ideal for everybody, for both sides of the party. I suspect they're different for all of our integrators, but I can't really speak to the details of them. And yeah, I think it's just, I understand your concern. I don't think I have enough expertise on those contracts to understand how they work and what parts benefit each party specifically.
Thanks, Amy. We've got another question in the chat from John Shepard. One concern with the odor footprint tool is the lack of local or specific wind data. Is there a good response to that?
So the odor footprint tool uses historic weather data for, I think there's 6 or 8 locations in the state, and you pick which you're closest to. So it's using National Weather Service weather station data. And you are correct that you could have a little bit different wind direction, wind speed 10 miles apart. But in general, within a region, your dominant wind speed and direction in the summer months versus the winter months doesn't fluctuate that much. Now, it definitely would from eastern Nebraska to western Nebraska, which is why we use data closer to each location, depending on location in the state. But the odor footprint tool, the data is not one single location in the state. It's going to be a location closest to your operation. And so short of having a weather station on that site that gets you site-specific data, it's the closest thing we have to being able to predict wind direction, wind speed during different times of the year.
Great. And another question from Roberto. Can you talk about getting rid of caucuses? So you talk about operations getting rid within 36 hours. What about the actual carcasses? Sorry.
Carcasses. Okay. I was like, man, I don't know anything about caucuses. Okay. That's a political thing.
Yes.
Yeah, so animal carcasses. So the rule is once you've discovered a dead animal, so most of the time you're going to find that pretty quickly if you're taking care of your animals the way you should. But on a ranch or something like that, you may not find a grazing animal for a couple of days. But when you do find them, there's basically 5 ways in the state that it's legal to dispose of them. There's land burial, so digging a hole on your property and burying the animal. That has some rules as far as what's the depth to groundwater, how many animals can you put on your property based on the land you have available. Composting, which is on-farm process of putting the animal in a compost pile and letting it degrade over time based on the microbes and the heat that's generated in that pile. There's landfilling. You're going to pay a fee to take an animal to a landfill, so I don't see many farmers doing that these days. Rendering facilities, we're seeing a decline in the amount of rendering opportunities in the state. If for instance, a rendering facility only is able to come out to your farm once a week, then you will need to have some sort of storage on your farm to keep that animal, usually a cooler, to keep that animal in until they can come and get it. So it's not creating odor. You're not just going to pile it by the road and wait for them to come get it. That's not allowed. And incineration. Incineration is great. It reduces the carcass to ash, but it's expensive. Most farmers aren't, the fuel cost and sizing it correctly for routine mortalities and then being able to use it for a catastrophic loss. It's not very practical, and there's air quality permitting required for that sort of a system. So a newer technology that is personally what I really like and I'm promoting for a lot of our farmers is sort of a mix of composting and burial. So it's shallow burial with carbon. So rather than just digging a deep hole and burying animals and covering them up, you're actually putting carbon material beneath them that helps with that carbon nitrogen balance to create some heat in there as the animals decompose. But it's covered with soil, and you don't have the runoff concerns with that you would have with a compost system if it's not built correctly and you've got more moisture being produced than the carbon material can absorb. So I like it. I've done research on that. To me, it's I think it's a good trade-off between burial and composting. But regardless of the system you use, you got to have those animals in it within 36 hours, and you cannot open it. You can't start a compost pile and a week later realize it's not really working, and then open it up and try to do something different with those carcasses. Once they're in there, and they need to stay in there. So I can expand on any of those if you have a question, but that's kind of a general overview of the systems we have.
Great. We have another question from Jane. Is there any political will to establish regs in all counties?
I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. I'm not sure if you're asking like having the same rules for every county or having every county develop rules in addition to the state rules. I think it would be great if we're going to have county level rules. It'd be great if they were the same in every county. I would have a lot easier time navigating those and helping farmers navigate them. I don't know that I don't know if that's a push that we're seeing or not. I haven't heard that.
Great. Any other last minute questions? All right. Thank you, Amy. Appreciate your time. And
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to visit. And like I say, I'm happy to do another one of these sometime and or answer questions directly. So feel free to shoot me an email if there was something I didn't get to today.
Great. That sounds good. Yeah, we'll send out the recording and we'll send out your contact information with that email, Amy. So.
Okay. And I'll share a PDF of my slides too. You can share that with
Perfect.
folks.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good weekend.